possible by a generous donation to the seminary that established the Dr. Donald G. and Nancy J. Dawe Fund for Emotional and Ethical Growth. This lecture series, which is held annually at Union Presbyterian Seminary, pays tribute to Dr. and Mrs. Dawe and promotes ethical and religious understanding. And I want to take this moment to thank Mrs. Nancy Dawe for being here tonight. Can we all please give a round of applause for Mrs. Dawe? Because of the Dawe's long-standing interests and commitments in the area of multi-religious and multicultural understanding and interfaith dialogue, this lecture series seeks to contribute to deepened awareness and insight in these areas of intellectual and especially practical religious concern. We want to extend a welcome to both our live audience here in the Lake Chapel as well as our live stream audience. We're honored to have you here, Mrs. Dawe, once again. And we look forward to learning from our presenter tonight, Dr. Leela Prasad. Leela Prasad is the Vice President of the American Academy of Religion and a Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University. Dr. Prasad's primary interests are the anthropology of ethics, with a focus on South Asia, colonialism and decoloniality, prison pedagogy, and Gandhi, as well as religion and modernity. Her work is at the intersections of religious studies, anthropology, history, and literature. Dr. Prasad's PhD is in folklore and folk life from the University of Pennsylvania, and her 2 Masters of Arts are in English from the University of Hyderabad and also from Kansas State University. She has received fellowships and awards from the American Academy of Religion, National Endowment for the Humanities, American Philosophical Society. In 2020, she held a Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellowship and held it again in 2021 and 2022. Her first book, Poetics of Conduct, won the American Academy of Religions Prize for the best first book in history of religions. Her latest book is The Audacious Raconteur, Sovereignty and Storytelling in Colonial India. In her free time, Dr. Prasad can be found playing with her dogs and or searching for more dogs that she can adopt. Tonight's lecture is titled, That Religion Which Underlies All Religions. So please, without further ado, please help me welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Leela Prasad.
Thank you, Chris, for that really lovely introduction. I always appreciate it when you mention my dogs. Can you hear? Is this clear? Is this better? Okay, excellent. So I was saying, thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction, very generous introduction, and thank you for mentioning my dogs. I also want to thank a whole bunch of people here. Dr. Taneti, thank you very much for extending the invitation to me. Chris, of course, President Blunt and family, all the AV staff and other staff here who made my visit possible, and a big thanks to Nancy Dawe herself. Thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you to all the audiences live and online that are here for this talk. I appreciate your coming out this evening. Thank you. So here we are. We do not have to go too far down the corridors of history to find Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a titanic figure who shaped struggles for self-governance and equality across the world. And yet, from the wars, the brutality, and the inequities that mark our world today, it would seem that there never had been a Gandhi. Thankfully, although he may not be on the inner rim of a responsible politics today, Gandhi seems to live on in the extraordinary work of ordinary individuals, where he inspires the idea of a more neighborly world. My talk this evening is not about that forgotten Gandhi, but about a Gandhian spirit, one that offers hope and possibility, and most importantly, a vision for co-being in a fractured world. In 2011, I visited Sevagram, Mahatma Gandhi's ashram near Wardha in the state of Maharashtra, Western India. An ashram, for those of you who may not know, is a place of communal living where lifestyle adheres to particular spiritual commitments. After Gandhi returned to India from South Africa in 1915, where he had lived for 21 years, he established the Satyagraha Ashram on the banks of the Sabarmati River in Gujarat, Western India. He left it in 1930 when he set out on his famous salt march to Dundee, another place, to disobey the British tax on salt, vowing not to return to Sabarmati until India gained independence from the British. It turned out he would never return to Sabarmati. He was assassinated in 1948, 5 months after India became free. In 1936, Gandhi founded Sevagram Ashram with the backing of his ardent supporter, the industrialist Jamnalal Bajaj. In the arid interior of Maharashtra, Sevagram manifested Gandhi's resolve to serve India's most backward regions and neglected populations. With me in 2011, visiting Sevagram Ashram was 6 of my students from Dawe, who are part of a year-long program I was directing in India. After we had wandered around the tree-filled ashram for a few hours, we ate the simple and wholesome evening meal prepared by the ashram's residents. Then, as the winter sun began to set, making giant silhouettes of trees, we gathered for the evening prayer in a rectangular courtyard, rolling out mats on the gravel. We were about to participate in a tradition of prayer that had been established by Gandhi. Amidst the sound of night insects and evening birds and the stillness of the ashram, by the light of a lantern, residents sang songs and recited selections from the sacred texts of different traditions to the accompaniment of an ektara, a single-stringed instrument. If you can see, the shadows have fallen on us. This experience was one of the most moving experiences of community I have ever felt. Ecumenical prayers had come to be integral to Gandhi's political praxis. They were arguably the solution to the moral predicament of India, as Gandhi saw it in 1909, when he wrote in his radical treatise, Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, open quotes, Religion is dear to me, and my first complaint is that India is becoming irreligious. Here I'm not thinking of the Hindu, Mohammedan, or the Zoroastrian religion, but of that religion which underlies all religions. We are turning away from God. So, what is this religion that underlies all religions? To answer this question, I turn to a song, one of Gandhi's favorites, that was always included in the prayer meetings. Now, when I play a snippet of this song, it's popularly called the Ram Dhun, or melody of Rama, okay, you will hear the words Rama and Sita. These names come from the Hindu epic of the Ramayana, in which the prince Rama rescues his beloved wife Sita, who had been abducted by a demon king. Sitaram is another name for Rama, alluding to his identity as Sita's Rama. Okay. Gandhi was raised in a religious environment in which the Ramayana epic was performed, read, and worshipped. He was himself an admirer of a particular regional telling of this epic. However, his Rama was a capacious figure, not restricted to the Ramayana's prince, but pointing to an inner divinity that is available to everyone. So let's listen to this song, and then I'll come back to it.
रघुपति राघव राजा राम पतित पावन सीताराम रघुपति राघव राजा राम
would like to draw your attention to an important word in Gandhi's lexicon, which appears in the song and one that I have highlighted. The word is sanmati. Sanmati is a Sanskrit word that means goodwill, wisdom, good sense, truth perceiving, and so on. Philosopher and grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, Ramchandra Gandhi, reminds us that etymologically, sanmati is the compounding of two words, sat and mati. Sat is absolute truth, the reality that suffuses everything and connects everything. Mati is mind or mental orientation. Sanmati is an orientation that perceives this reality of interconnectedness between phenomena, people, and forms of life. I take this etymology further to argue that sanmati is the practice of generous orientation. The word generous allows me to underscore the imaginative and active effort it takes to recognize the symbiotic kinship that connects us all. The origins of the Ramdhun song that you just heard are debated. The Gandhi scholar Tridip Suhrut points out that, open quotes, it was Gandhi's grandniece, Manu, who fundamentally altered the very nature of the Ramdhun by inserting these lines, Ishwar Allah tere naam, sabko sanmati de Bhagavan, to the ancient lines, Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram, in a moment of deep inspiration during a prayer meeting, close quotes. We recall that the lines mean, Ishwar and Allah are your names. Please God, give sanmati, grant sanmati to all. 20 years before the lines came into being, Gandhi had said in the journal Young India, Rama, Allah, and God are to me convertible terms. Indeed, all the variants of the song have retained this interfaith spirit, explicit in a 1970 fusion composition of Ananda Shankar, who is Ravi Shankar's nephew. So let's listen to that. Let's listen to this one.
Let us sing in praise of Rama, who is the eternal one, the one without a second. It matters little whether we call him Allah, Buddha, Christ or Jehovah. He belongs equally to us all. Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram, Patita Pavana Sita Ram. Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram, Patita Pavana Sita Ram. Ishwar Allah tere naam, sabko sanmati de Bhagavan. Ishwar Allah tere naam.
The lines acquired a unique visionary tone when Gandhi embraced them, seeing them necessary to remind the Indian public time and again through song and speech and service that if there was to be a free and progressive and pluralistic India, Indians would have to respectfully recognize that God has different names and different forms, or no name and no form, and there are many paths to truth. As Gandhi writes in his autobiography, open quotes, truth is the sovereign principle, which includes numerous other principles. This truth is not only truthfulness in word, but truthfulness in thought also, and not only the relative truth of our conception, but absolute truth, the eternal principle, that is God. There are innumerable definitions of God because his manifestations are many. They overwhelm me with wonder and awe, and for a moment stun me. But I worship God as truth only. I think if Gandhi were alive today, he wouldn't call God him. I think he would be open to many genders and many races and many colors. I really believe that. Gandhi arrives at these convictions after reading and reflecting on the scriptures of the religions of the world during his days as a student in London, and also during his stay in South Africa. He read the Quran and the Old Testament, Edwin Arnold's biography of the Buddha. He engaged theosophy, for example, and he formed opinions and debated concepts with his Christian and Muslim friends. He was profoundly influenced by teachings that urged service, non-harm, sacrifice, and love, both within his own Hindu tradition and in other religions, often reading these as an invitation to self-scrutiny, experimentation, and self-transformation. The New Testament's Sermon on the Mount, Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You, Ruskin's Unto This Last, and the Bhagavad Gita were part of a synthesized everyday practice for him. His spiritual mentor was a contemporary, a guru by the name of Srimad Raj Chandra, who was a Jain monk, a mystic, a poet, and a philosopher, who advised him to immerse in and understand the religious resources of his upbringing. In a turbulent India that was polarizing along Hindu-Muslim lines, the prayer for Sanmati was an urgent one, quite consistent with his famous conviction that there can be no truth, there can be no politics without religion, by which he meant there can be no politics without truth. Gandhi brought the concept of Sanmati to the secular domain, where he believed it would yield a politics of collective mindedness, one that appreciates and accepts religious differences, and thereby promote flourishing. For Gandhi, pluralism depended on Sanmati, which he imagined as a potential that could be awakened within oneself. So I'm now going to illustrate this idea, this concept of Sanmati through three acts, each is set in a different, distinct time and place. Okay. The first act. On February 13th, 2018, a mini truck refurbished and bedecked to resemble an ornate pillared Hindu temple began its 41-day journey through 6 states of India. By itself, in a land of pilgrimage traditions, multiple faiths, and adaptive forms of worship, the glitzy chariot's journey would not have taken headline space. But the chariot's itinerary and intent, engineered by the Hindu nationalist organization, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, VHP henceforth, contained multiple ancient and modern refurbished histories that secured it front page coverage in the Indian media. The chariot procession's intent was to pressure the government of India to consent to building a grand temple to Rama, as envisioned by the VHP, on a site in Ayodhya in North India, that is a site that is sacred to both Hindus and Muslims, and to forge public opinion in favor of this demand. On this site was a historic mosque that had been of interest to Hindu nationalists from the mid-19th century. Hindus claimed that the founder of the Mughal Empire, Babur, had destroyed a temple marking the place of Rama's birth and built a mosque that came to be eponymously called the Babri Masjid. The mosque, with its 3 domes and 3 arches, used to sit on a hillock overlooking the river Sarayu, in whose vicinity were many shrines associated with the epic of the Ramayana. In the outer courtyard of the mosque are smaller but important structures such as Sita's kitchen, Ram's platform, a storage unit, and so on. A controversial history and several investigations over decades have remained divided on the questions of what the original structures may have been, who built what, who destroyed what, who transposed and grafted what architectural remnants from which structure, and so on. Debated also are the roles of Afghan invaders, Mughal rulers, Hindu kings, who had been a patron, who a tyrant, who irrelevant, and so on. On December 8, 1992, a Hindu mob mobilized by the right-wing political party, the BJP, which is the political arm of the VHP that I just mentioned, demolished brick by brick the mosque, impassioned by the slogan, "Mandir wahi banayenge," which means we will build the temple nowhere but there. More than 2,000 people lost their lives across the country in the riots that followed. As the past bristled with unresolved questions, the site of the mosque turned into a zone of conflict, quietly obliterating the fact that for some time, Hindus and Muslims had prayed amicably alongside each other at that site. also obliterated in the conflict is the fact that an India without its Islamic past would need to tear down its secular infrastructure, give up a vastly popular cuisine, forego styles of clothing and textile arts, bury its Mughal gardens, and forget influential and literary and musical traditions, in fact, sacrifice a part of its soul and substance. Muslims and Hindus litigated the ownership of the site from 1885. A 1949 order barred Muslims from praying in the mosque. In February 2020, the Supreme Court of India declared that the disputed land in Ayodhya was to be given to a Hindu trust for the construction of a Ram temple. It's a much more complicated history that I've condensed here. The trust had been formed by members of the nationalist VHP. The Sunni Central Waqf Board was to be compensated with land for the construction of a mosque in Ayodhya. The politicians who instigated the 1992 destruction of the mosque would be tried in a separate criminal case, and incidentally, they were acquitted. Some have argued that the verdict was perhaps the most pragmatic one possible, considering the contentious nature of virtually all aspects of the case. But the verdict, in my opinion, fails in one crucial way. It concedes to an ideology founded on exclusionary principles and tactics, and it offers only a minor concession to a community already minoritized by other legislation. It sets a precedent to open other sites across India to agents invested in revisionist history. In short, the verdict fails to embody the spirit of pluralism that can heal, assure, and generate co-being. As Gandhi had said, in the dispensation of justice, unless there is a change in the mindset of opponents, there can be little moral victory. We can say that the verdict did not change any minds. We get a glimpse of how a transformation of mindset can in fact occur in an account that the philosopher Ramchandra Gandhi, just mentioned he was Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, tells us in his book, Sita's Kitchen, A Testimony of Faith and Inquiry, which was published 5 years before the mosque was destroyed. Disturbed by the convolutions of history that made it hard to discern facts from assumptions, he visited the mosque in Ayodhya. It was 5 years before, right? It was destroyed. As he stood in front of the mosque and gazed at the main arch, he saw the carved lotuses, open quotes, the carved lotuses and pictures on the small pillars supporting it at the bottom, and the hexagonal tantric motifs on the walls above the arches, and other unmistakably Hindu features of the structure, close quotes. And he decided that, open quotes, there could be little doubt that the sacred components of a Hindu temple or a cognate Buddhist or Jaina shrine had been used in the construction of the mosque in the 16th century, close quotes. He was stricken with sorrow. Open quotes again. He says, whatever be the precise historical truth of this matter, he writes, the fact remains that the mosque owes its existence to the despoliation of structures sacred to Indian spirituality and does not hide this fact, adding insult to injury, says my wounded Hindu pride. And he concludes, the child in me grieved. A few moments later, however, his grief turned into a greater anguish. He writes, open quotes, the adult in me awakened to the reality of the images of Rama and Sita and other Hindu deities in the sanctum sanctorum of the house of Allah, to the fact of stealthy trespass with intent which converted the Babri mosque into a Rama temple more than 40 years ago, to the fact that the chanting of the names of Rama and Sita had been used to silence nearly half a millennium's call to Islamic prayer, to the fact that Muslims were not allowed to come anywhere near the mosque under siege, and so on. He closed his eyes to meditate on this realization. When he opened them, he saw a sign of contemporary making in Hindi announcing the spot as Janmasthan Sita Ki Rasoi, or Sita's Kitchen in the birthplace of Rama. Sita's Kitchen becomes a restorative metaphor, a magic inscription in crude paint, as he calls it. He finds in the architectural idea of Sita's Kitchen an archetypal notion. And he says, "It is on earth," these are his words, "it is on earth, in the embrace of the Divine Mother, that all are born, all creatures great and small, all forms manifest, noble and evil, and all are nourished." Close quotes. Why do I see this shift in Ramchandra Gandhi's response to the mosque so powerful? His initial response is clearly a reaction to the visuality of Hindu, Buddhist, Jain pillars and imagery in the mosque, and reflects his internalization of the commonplace narrative that those invading Muslims desecrated our temples. The reaction contains a familiar identification, but also a disidentification. Me is most certainly not the other. However, Ramchandra Gandhi's transition from grief for one's own to anguish for another communicates a special transcendence, which I argue is the essence of Sanmati, generous orientation. The transcendence is not a removal from contested and unknowable historical events, but an overcoming of the me-other divide. The transition in his response therefore posits the question, can my flourishing ever come from the abjection of another? This question shows that what is my own now extends to include what was the other. It is Sanmati that allows Ramchandra Gandhi to reimagine the entire site, the Babri Masjid, the hill on Ramkot, and all of India as a place of birth and nourishment for all, irrespective of religion. It is Sanmati that is the religion that underlies all religions. Move on to Act 2. You ready for a leap? Sringeri is a Hindu pilgrimage town in South India, about 9 hours from the city of Bengaluru, up in the rain-soaked western mountains of India. It is most well known for its temple to Sharada, the Hindu goddess of learning, and for its monastery that was established by the 8th century philosopher Shankara. The monastery interprets texts known as the Dharma Shastras, codes of conduct and law for Hindus across the world. Residents in Sringeri of all faiths, feel a special affection for the goddess and the guru. The main street has a Jain temple, and north of the town is a mosque in a neighborhood where Muslims have traditionally lived. During my fieldwork in Sringeri in 1994-95 that led to my book Poetics of Conduct, my landlord, Mr. Bhatt, a school teacher, recounted an incident about an unusual visitor to the temple town. In the 1980s, the guru had sanctioned the reconstruction of a local hilltop temple. Steep stone steps flanked by trees lead up to the temple. During the renovation, they discovered that the central image of the god Shiva had to be removed from its pedestal. Discussions about how to do this followed. While these discussions were underway, a strange thing happened. Suddenly, a leopard was seen in town. Nobody knew where it had come from. It roamed around for who knows how many days. At night, it would sleep in cattle sheds and slip away when an alarm was raised. And the news terrified pilgrims. This is a pilgrim town. The leopard but could not be trapped. And at this point, the guru started getting worried. Should I have not undertaken the reconstruction of the Shiva image, he asked himself. And then he prayed, please don't harm anyone. I will finish this task quickly. I did not realize that I had disturbed something that had been here for generations. Soon after this, many people saw the leopard run up the hill, up the steps of the hill temple, and it was never seen in town again. So this is the story I heard from Mr. Bhatt. I heard another version of the leopard story from Mr. Zia Ahmed, once a prominent Muslim member of Sringeri's town council. He too said that the leopard had eluded the forest department officials. But here's what's interesting about his account. The leopard's appearance coincided, he said, with the renovation plan that would have tampered with an unfrequented mazar, which is a tomb of a Muslim saint, that was on the hilltop. Mr. Ahmed said that when the guru of the monastery heard about the plan, he immediately sent word to the renovation team to leave the mazar undisturbed. They heeded his advice, and the leopard vanished from town. The guru has muhabbat for us. Muhabbat is the word for love. The guru has muhabbat for us, he mused as he concluded his story. When I asked him about the story that the leopard had appeared because the Shiva image was disturbed, he said, "Yeah, they say that too." I told Mr. Bhatt about the mazar story. He acknowledged that he'd heard that story and said, "Who knows for sure with regard to such things?" The two narrations suggest how we might think about co-occupied space. They contain lessons that have a recurring urgency, unfortunately. First, Mr. Ahmed and Mr. Bhatt did not dispute the other story when I mentioned it, and they did not make a fuss about knowing it. Just as the mazar and the Shiva shrine had existed in the same complex for generations, and there was little reason to alter that arrangement, there seemed to be no reason for narratives to encroach on one another. Do we see here an organic acceptance of plural ownerships, mirrored in the Guru's own acknowledgement of the sacrality of the mazar? Second, there is a humility in the shared understanding that the mysterious gives us the opportunity to pause and pay attention to the effect of human action on cosmic order. Sanmati comes from the ahimsaik, which is the non-conflictual and generous-minded admission that there can be other possibilities, other potential truths, some knowable, some unknowable. Which brings me to the last and final act, Act 3. In 2013, at age 91, the celebrated Indo-French painter Syed Haider Raza undertook a series of 7 paintings with a Gandhian theme. Raza was 8 years old when he first saw Gandhi, who had come to address a public meeting in Raza's hometown. The image of the ascetically clad Gandhi became a muse for Gandhi's artistic imagination. When his extended family's homes were vandalized during the ethnic violence of the partition that splintered South Asia, many of his relatives left for Pakistan. Raza decided not to leave. He told his close friend, the poet and critic Ashok Vajpayee, that the reason for choosing to stay was Gandhi. And then his career in art took off, and after 6 decades in France following this career, Raza returned to India for good in 2011. On every visit to India, it had become a personal tradition for him to go to Gandhi's ashrams in Sevagram and Sabarmati, and the Gandhi Memorial in Rajghat in New Delhi. The first of Raza's paintings takes its title, Hey Ram, from the last words believed to have been uttered by Gandhi as he fell to the bullets of an assassin in 1948. The second, Peed Parai, the second title, Peed Parai, is a phrase in the Gujarati language which means the suffering of others. It comes from a song called Vaishnava Janato, composed in the 15th century by the poet saint Narsingh Mehta. Gandhi dearly loved this song, which describes the qualities of a true worshipper, one who empathizes with the predicament of another. The Vaishnava Janato song parallels the Ram Dhun, which you've heard, in popularity, and for Gandhi it was a living scripture. Gandhi's paintings titled Satya, which means truth, Shanti or peace, and thoughts of Gandhiji enshrine axioms of Gandhian philosophy on canvas, with written text not being an exhortation but an invocation. The painting Swadharma, which means one's duty, traces itself to the idea of individual dharma, duty, and responsibility enjoined by the freedom fighter and Gandhi's friend Vinoba Bhave. Let's look at the painting Sanmati. As you can see, it is a grid of interlocking squares, rectangles, and triangles. At the center is a large black circle with a white dot. At the lower right-hand corner is the line, which I transliterate from the Hindi, Sabko Sanmati, De Bhagavan. We pray that you give Sanmati to everyone. The many shapes and colors visually express the other unreproduced line, Ishwar Allah Tero Naam, or Ishwar Allah, or both your names, evoking the connected manyness of the divine. The painting captures the flow between the oral and the visual, manifesting Raza's belief that a painting must be seen with the ear. Raza's Sanmati is a mandala, a tantric geometrical diagram prominently used in Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu art, ritual, architecture, and personal spiritual practice. While the symbolism of the mandala varies across history and tradition, it is usually understood as a metaphor for individual and cosmic energies, and as a tool that can bring these energies into balance and harmony. Raza explains, quote, my preoccupation lies in the arrangement of colored space. The equilibrium of forces is as necessary in painting as it is in life, close quotes. The rough brush strokes leave the work of the brush exposed, and in this exposure, the strokes display an unpredictable blending of solids and shades. Browns mingle with yellows, orange mingles with brown, brown into grays, and so on. The colors, earthy and vivid, and the strokes, rough but distinct, play out the aesthetic of Sanmati, which recognizes humanity's everyday states, their intrinsic manyness, and their interconnectedness. The symmetrical juxtaposition leads to the focal point in the diagram, a tiny white dot, the bindu, in the center of the black circle. As Raza says, the bindu is full of potential. It is the seed, the very beginning. In the West, one paints that which can be seen by the retina of the eye. I have gone beyond immediate vision. I wish to grasp Prakriti, which is nature in Hindu thinking. Seen through these remarks, Sanmati harmoniously accommodates the diversity of life forms. It is hence the seed of human flourishing. To conclude, I have argued that Sanmati is a generous orientation that overcomes the me-other divide, that admits that other worldviews can also be true, and that recognizes humanity's interconnectedness across differences and other life forms. This orientation is the poetry, the soul of worthwhile living, the very ground on which co-being is imaginable and achievable. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. Certainly.
I'm happy to start the questions for everyone. You know, this principle of Sanmati, a generous orientation, feels like it should be a pretty easy thing for everyone to buy into, like leading with kindness. That does feel like it has a universal appeal. What do you think are some of the stumbling blocks that happen in terms of people being able to like live this out, in terms of being so focused on the differences that we can't see the similarities, like honoring those distinctions, but still using them almost as borders that prohibit a sense of commonality?
I guess, it's a great question, Chris. I think the stumbling blocks would be almost the reverse of everything I've said, such as, things like, we are very committed to our own stories, and it takes a lot to yield your story to another story. And so I think part of the problem is that. There's also spatial inhibitions. There are all kinds of, you'd think, not very grand reasons for not being able to practice Sanmati, but they're all part of the everyday. It's in the everyday that it becomes hard to to practice Sanmati, and yet it is in the everyday that we actually can. Once you become aware of things like that, whose story, who holds whose stories, can I share my story, can I hear someone else's point of view? All the conflicts in the world, Palestine, everywhere that you look, there's a history of not accommodating. So I think, there are too many examples out there of blocks to Sanmati that make it more impossible than it ought to be. It seems like, because some of the examples I've given here are actually from very everyday examples, especially the leopard story. It's such a non-eventful story. It didn't make headlines anywhere. It was just told by this local, the people in that town. And yet it told me a lot about, how did they make this work? It's not the case everywhere that you see this. And yet, I think there's such a skepticism in the academy to seeing the work of harmony that, this can't be real. But in places like Sringeri, and there are tons of places, our own neighborhoods, you find examples of, kind of routine Sanmati that I think should be headline news. That's a sort of a long response to your wonderful question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that interesting talk. I teach theology, so I'm always interested in theological concepts. I also want to say I used to teach a little bit of Gandhi, so when I was still an undergraduate professor, I had no right to teach him because my knowledge of him is very limited, but I always found him so interesting, so thoughtful. When I think about something, interreligious dialogue, and, to use a sort of a stereotypical phrase, it often focuses on ways in which we find commonalities. And one of the things that's always struck me is that so often we find commonalities with religions different from our own by interpreting those religions in terms of our own religion. So, Christians might speak about an inclusive, anonymous Christianity, or something like our honor might say. I think Hinduism lends itself to an inclusive way of thinking, etc. So one of my questions, the kind of a half-baked question I have for you is Sanmati a concept that can help us find common ground even when there is actually no common ground in terms of theological statements or beliefs or a common understanding of God, or you know what I'm saying with that? Yeah, so that's kind of my curiosity. Is this something that is in a different category than just another way of trying to find sort of a correspondence between religions?
And you've put that really well, actually. In fact, there's a part of your question that answers itself, I think, which you've put it really well. I think Sanmati is that in-between space. It's an orientation that does actually allow you to find not commonality in terms of your tradition, but in terms of its own thing. That it almost doesn't matter if the terms don't match, but that you can agree on something else. I think in the leopard story, let me go back to that very everyday story, is, there's that sense of, it doesn't really matter whether it was the mazar that was disturbed or the Shivlinga that was disturbed. The difference is not in the detail. The difference is in the thing that they both seem to care about, which is, when something mysterious happens, how are those things resolved? You care about that, I care about that. So, I don't think Sanmati is an invitation to convert everything into the terms of your tradition or anything like that. But it's almost the opposite, which is step into something else. And it's an orientation to be so open that you can actually consider the idea of, well, this is how I do it, but gee, there must be 1,000 other ways of doing this that are all equally true. I think, to me, Sanmati is very tied, and I don't want to get off into that, but very tied to the idea of equality. There's something fundamentally off our planet when we have got into the habit of thinking X or Y is less equal than the history of this own country. is living testament to that problem. And Sanmati tries to overcome that, with this sense, a generous orientation is not an act of charity here, but it's an orientation that allows you to see there's absolutely no difference beyond the superficial differences and the cultural and the historical blah blah differences between us, that there's something that makes you and me us, two people who are, I think it's that kind of, it's beyond the kind of superficial let's find common ground thing, or convert the terms of one into terms of another, but it is, it's very embryonically tied to how we imagine and enact equality, absolute equality, radical equality, Yeah.
Yes, thank you for this powerful talk on Gandhi. I'm wondering about the political situation, social situation in America today, and I'm reminded that Abraham Lincoln, in a similarly polarized time, talked about our better angels in his second inaugural, and I'm not sure he found that in his time, and I'm not sure we're finding that in our own very politically, socially divided place that we're in this country. But there's something that happens in community organizing that, and I know in Durham there's a community organizing organization that's really doing effective work. At the core of every community organizing organization is what they call a relational meeting, in which we just listen to one another's stories without judgment. We just sit and listen to try to find some commonality upon which we can move. And I wonder if there's any other place that we can find a mechanism through which we can kind of overcome some of these binaries that we're finding ourselves in.
Can you say a little more about your question, actually? It's a very interesting question. Are there other places where one can find mechanisms of listening? Was that? I'm afraid everywhere. There are opportunities to find commonality. I'm going to walk it back a little bit in a second. Opportunities to discover common ground and create common ground. Just about everything we do. There is always an opportunity for creating that sense of listening. But I want to I trouble myself by asking the question, what happens if you don't find commonality? That if you actually don't have? Because you're thinking about, race relations, you think about the colonial oppression, this, that, and the other, so many, and how do you find commonality? And, I think I turn to Gandhi, I turn to Ambedkar, these are people who actually dealt with, when you cannot find commonality, or it seems that there is no commonality, what then? Is it hatred? Is it, I'll walk away from here? Is it, what are the kinds of questions you'll ask yourself in the absence of commonality? That's sort of where I think active listening comes to play. So thank you for bringing that up. I think the active listening is about, okay, it is unlikely that I'm going to find some great convivial commonality with my oppressor or someone who has treated me in the worst possible racist ways. Can I find commonality? But the answer already I kind of knew that maybe not. But what then? But to not ask the question and to walk away seems like, a repeat of history over and over and over again. It's a really good question, thank you. Yeah.
As I was hearing you speak, I was wondering how you might see Sanmati through the lenses of power and vulnerability.
Power?
Power and vulnerability, and how you may see power and vulnerability through the lenses of Sanmati.
So the second part of the question I didn't get. Power and vulnerability.
Through the lenses of Sanmati. As I was listening to you speak, I was very curious about how some of the themes you were emphasizing may be challenged by and challenge systems and dynamics and realities of power and authority.
Yeah. I mean, if I've understood your question right, I think the key words here are really listening and vulnerability, and how the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar was about, did Gandhi sufficiently understand, quote unquote untouchables? Did he, and so there's that on. So your question is right on the ball with, how does Sanmati look to someone who is deeply vulnerable, and is it something, because I see Sanmati so much as a dialogic thing, as an orientation that is co-cultivated, in unequal ways also. It begins somewhere. I think it is from the vulnerables that the biggest challenges to power are actually placed. So it's sort of the weapons of the weak kind of thing, So I think Sanmati is actually a really powerful weapon, and I don't mean that in a violent way, of someone who's really vulnerable, because it is sort of, and Gandhi was taking from, many others before him and around him, of how do you deal with, powerful, violent figures, from a place of no power or less. And his answer was, you are never entirely powerless. There's something that cannot be taken from you. My second book is about, a kind of epistemic sovereignty that you always hold. The Caribbean writer, George Lamming, said this beautifully. He said, there's 1 acre of ground that can't be taken from you by anyone, And so you get beaten, you're chained, you're this and you're that, and you're whipped, but there's something that cannot be taken. You cannot take my capacity for storytelling. You cannot take my capacity for singing songs. I can tap dance, things like that. So I think the human spirit, with all its, with all the problems of power that we have, remains sovereign. And it's through that sovereignty that even the most vulnerable can express and have the capacity to express Sanmati and cultivate it. It's necessary, Thank you.
Dr. Prasad, thank you. I appreciate this clear, convincing, learned a lot, especially on the blind spots that I ignored. I appreciated your time and presentation. 93, there was this proposal. Of course, I was one of those who wept, literally wept, on the news of Ayodhya. Some proposal, not able to remember who said, why not have a site of worship where all religions can come and worship on the dais of the mosque. Of course, then someone said, aren't you inflicting pain and humiliation on the pain that is already there? Of course, became a site of conflict, but to make it a site of protest and worship can equally be humiliating was a debate that was there. And now coming back to my question, of course, you gave me several answers and also questions. I'm grateful for that. And I don't expect you to respond to all my questions. I had to find out answers. But this whole idea, notion of Satmati or Sanmati, as a student of history, where does it have its roots? Is it with Gandhi or beyond 16th century, 19th century? Of course, I need to find out, but want to see if you can give me some leads on that history of the idea of Satmati or Sanmati.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know, I too will need to go back and do some historical excavation around that term. I know one thing though, that it acquired a political relevance. It must have been available in Jain traditions, the idea, it's not, there was one thing that was amazing about Gandhi was that he wasn't particularly original about anything, but he was able to take what he got from all kinds of traditions and find a political use for it, and not in a narrow kind of way. Nonviolence was certainly not a new idea, right? But he makes it perhaps the first person who ever did that, to make it a tool of mobilization on a large scale. So Sanmati too, I think it's been around. The fact that this compounding exists and it's possible. I haven't, in my cursory look, I haven't found a great exposition of it in early texts and this, that, and the other. But I haven't done a thorough investigation of that. I just find its ambience and its resonance is really heavy during the colonial period. Because center stage was this question of how do you take on an oppressor without hatred? Yeah.
We have a couple of questions online.
Okay.
First, how do we celebrate our own particularity without making it normative?
By cultivating Sanmati. I mean, that's a good question. I don't think Sanmati, this generosity of orientation, asks you to run down your particularity. It's not really about that. I think the question is, this particularity and that particularity and this relative truth and that relative truth, there's no end to this. As you celebrate each of these particularities, the question then is, okay, so then what's the common piece? Or how do you construct a common piece, even when it's not visibly there? How do you construct? So I think Sanmati is all about not making the particularity a normative. That is the beginning of domination. When your little chip becomes the chip of the world, who is to say? As Ramchandra Bhatt would say, how do we know for sure? The relative truths matter, but they are not the only truth.
Our second question is, given your lecture's illustration and definition, how does Sanmati relate to Gandhi's concept of satyagraha? Is it complementary, in parallel, of equal import, or something other?
So satyagraha, for those of you who are catching up with this kind of stuff, was a method of, the word translates to truth force, satyagraha. Agraha is, by the force of, and satya is truth, you're familiar with that. So doing political protests and protesting against an injustice by the force of truth, not by the weaponry, is satyagraha. And the question is, does Sanmati really? I think, satyagraha has a complex of things going on in it. When Gandhi wrote about this and this system of protest, he was figuring out all the different pieces. One of the pieces was, don't bother to indulge in political protest if you haven't committed to a process of self-purification first. Okay, so a day of fasting, a day of prayer, turn the gaze inward, scrutinize your motives. Why the intent? Are you doing this for public gallery? Are you doing this for a vote? And so that inward gaze precedes any kind of protest for injustices. And so there are lots of pieces to the satyagraha. The second piece was, satyagraha doesn't really work if it isn't accompanied by a certain kind of grace. And by that he meant, civility. You can't be slamming your opponent. You can't be making an enemy of your opponent. Rather, you oppose the act. So there are no people to be hated. There are things, acts of injustice that you disavow. So there are these different pieces. And the third, civility is another. And the third was, what I also mentioned in the talk, which is that there has to be a transformation of both parties during political, injustice work. And so I think Sanmati is very much part of the satyagraha piece, which is, goodwill has got to saturate injustice, anti-injustice work. It can't be done with the energy and passion of hatred and enmity. It has to come from, a different place. So I think the question's a really good one, but Sanmati is part and parcel of that whole thing. I think in Gandhi's ethic, nothing stands just by itself. It's all integrated into a system, a network of concepts.
So, like Dr. Bard was looking at how we would tend towards to look for commonalities, I was already engaging in that, in kind of wondering if you have come across this something akin, at least, to Samadhi, or how you would place it in any other wisdom traditions. I'm thinking in the you're talking about moving into this space of where we do not find commonality, and I think of some of the Christian mystics and like the cloud of unknowing, and moving into those silent spaces, kind of a kenosis. Is that what this is moving towards, or how are there any relations to this South Asian origin? Is that, how have you seen any parallels in any other traditions?
I think across the gamut of South Asian religious traditions, whether it's South Asian Islam, whether it's, the variety of them, the notion of generous orientation is out there. It's not. I haven't seen, as I was telling Dr. Taneti, that any particular exposition of the idea in any one tradition, except in songs and story texts and allusions here and there. But it's limited knowledge at this point. But I think the idea of generosity, of a certain kind of, radical generosity, not the surface generosity, but where you're kind of, willing to shake up your comfort spaces, suspend your story, take on, and all of that is available across varieties of South Asian traditions. So it's a certain tooling that happens of the idea, rather than, I must say that, not finding commonality is a very common experience for all of us. I teach in the prison, both in the federal prison as well as in the state prisons in North Carolina. And in the few years that I've been doing this, I have discovered that when you assume that there is no commonality, like someone like me teaching in a prison with all the cultural differences between me and others and what have you, and there's plenty there to feel uncommonality, and yet I can tell you that that's one place I love to teach because of the commonality I discover time and again, in small minutiae ways, and it's that minutiae level of. This seems like a long response to your, question, but yeah, commonality and yeah. Thank you.
We have time for one final question.
Thank you, Dr. Leela Prasad. I totally agree with you that there's power in vulnerability, power not in the sense of dominating, but to resist and be resilient. And that's how the Dalit communities, the oppressed communities, have been exercising that power for the survival through the ages. In Indian context, when popular Hinduism, and there's on the other side the majoritarian Hinduism, there is a threat to the democracy or secularism. This has been there in and around India. And when we are talking about Sanmati, where the dominant and the oppressed, where the weak and the powerful can find a ground, a kind of a liminal space, who should take the initiative? Because these lines are very much dividing, discriminating. So who would take the first step? How to initiate this? Thank you.
Nice question. I don't know that there is, a protocol for Sanmati. I think it is, the way I prefer to look at it is that, hey, I can cultivate this. I'm not waiting for someone else to cultivate it. I'm not waiting for someone else to make the first move. If you're protesting or you're working with communities, then it's beholden on you to jump into it, So, but I see what you're saying about, in the equations between power and all those unequal equations of power that we all everywhere, who is supposed to make the move? And I just shift that question a little bit to say I don't think there needs to be a first step by someone else. This is so much an initiative, inward-looking thing. It's not unmindful of inequities. It is absolutely not sort of like this glorious, harmonious, utopian way of just, let's be goodwill, let's have goodwill. It's not that. It's absolutely cognizant of imbalanced power relations. But it's in the thick of that. So I don't know. I don't know if one or the other should, everyone, anytime.
Once again, I just want to thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr. Prasad, for being here this evening. And thank you to all of you here who are watching in person, those of you who are watching this through live stream and the replay video that will be available at a later time. Thank you all so much for being here, and have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.